hope you're all doing great this afternoon. As Director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Melissa Giblin, and we are excited to have you here at our virtual book event. With many other choices as to how to spend your time, I thank you for choosing this event and for joining us at this year's Great Reads from Great Places virtual book conversation. Great Reads from Great Places is a reading list distributed by the Library of Congress's Center for the Book as part of the National Book Festival, which was held on September 3rd in Washington, D.C. As a statewide nonprofit and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, for humanities councils within each state and jurisdiction, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This afternoon features a moderated panel discussion on The Tobacco Wives, our 2022 Great Reads from Great Places adult selection. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. We would like to welcome Adele Myers and Beth Nevarez as our panelists for today. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for today's event and practice how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session if you would like to visit our website and YouTube page to rewatch this event. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab or through the chat. Closed caption is available by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging @NCHumanities. And it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's event. Adele Myers is the author of The Tobacco Wives. Her debut novel was inspired by her childhood growing up in North Carolina tobacco country. She has a journalism degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and currently works in advertising and lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband, son, and their rescue dog, Chipper. Beth Nevarez is an independent public historian and museum consultant. She has a master's degree in public history and nearly 10 years experience in museums and archives. Through her business, Beth Nevarez Historical Consulting, she works with museums and other organizations on artifact care, research, and exhibit writing. Some of her clients include the Ava Gardner Museum, the Tobacco Farm Life Museum, and the Freeman Roundhouse Museum. So Adele and Beth, thanks so much for being here today and welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you both here, and I'm sure our audience is excited to get started. So let's dive right in. Adele, I'll start with you. What inspired the idea for your book, The Tobacco Wives?
The book was really inspired by my family history, which you mentioned in the bio. I spent a great deal of time in Winston-Salem, which is where both of my sets of grandparents are from. My parents actually met at R.J. Reynolds High School, and I spent my summers there, although I also lived in Asheville for part of my childhood. So the spark for the story really came from one of my grandmothers, and we called her Mema, and Mema was a hairdresser for the wives of R.J. Reynolds tobacco executives in the 1940s. And as a little girl, I was just fascinated, I think more by the idea of these women than the reality of their lives. And that's kind of what as an adult looking back on intrigued me about these women, because as a little girl, my what I imagined their lives were like, I kind of idolized them, and I beg my grandmother to tell me stories about these women. I thought that because she was their hairdresser, she must have a lot of good stories and good gossip, and she never really did give me any good gossip. She was very religious, and so I think in some ways she inspired the book by she inspired me to come up with my own stories about these women. And then across town, my other grandmother, who we called Granny, was a seamstress. And so the protagonist of the book is a young woman who's a seamstress, and that was inspired by my experience with my grandmother, watching her sew and going to the fabric stores with her. So the whole book was very much steeped in my childhood and my feeling of connection to Winston-Salem and to my family members who worked with R.J. Reynolds.
Thank you for sharing that, Adele. I really appreciate that you were able to elaborate on what we talked about with your brief introduction in the bio, and really connect it to something that is so important with your family memories and in your family's history here in the States. Beth, for you, slightly different, but kind of on the same topic as we delve into the book. What is, if you can kind of set the stage for us, the larger historical and cultural context of tobacco and tobacco farming in North Carolina?
Yeah, tobacco has a long history of being important economically, but also socially and culturally in North Carolina. I mean, starting even before colonial settlers arrived, Native Americans grew tobacco. And then it was a really important commodity for colonial North Carolina, as well as the early state of North Carolina. But when it really became a huge cash crop was after the Civil War. It started to replace cotton as the most important crop for farmers. And that was partly because of the rise of cigarettes in popularity. Around the 1880s is when they were able to start manufacturing cigarettes. Instead of by hand, a machine was invented that made it much faster. And that in turn made cigarettes much cheaper as well. So the rise in popularity of cigarettes led to increased demand of tobacco as a crop. And so it became this huge cash crop, started to outpace cotton. And that really impacted farmers' lives. At that time, the majority of people still lived on farms. And so it was their main crop. It was a really labor-intensive crop. And it took pretty much the whole year to grow it, harvest it, and get it ready for auction. And so it really, it made life what it was. They sort of made their lives around tobacco, and it impacted their work, their leisure time, pretty much everything. It was very pervasive in culture and society because of what a big impact it had economically.
Yeah, and I think we do see that quite a bit in the novel. We see, Maddie's description of the tobacco factories, and she arrives, in the summer when they're right kind of in the process of processing it so that it can be, made into cigarettes. So it's definitely a key feature of Adele's novel because, like you said, as in the farm communities and in these tobacco communities too, everyone sort of works for the company, and the company, is featured prominently.
Yeah, and I would say, it impacted farmers, of course, but also many towns and cities existed because of tobacco, and the warehouses in Wilson, where I live, had a lot of large warehouses, and that's definitely contributed to its growth, and it employed a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely. So while we're there, we'll kind of turn our attention to the main character in the story. Maddie, of course, is the main character in Tobacco Wives, and she is surrounded by a lot of strong female leads, a lot of female figures throughout the story. So this question is to both of you, and it kind of has a couple parts. How do you think Maddie's opinion about women and their roles in society changed after living and working in Brightleaf for the summer? And Adele, we'll start with you.
So I think her attitudes about women changed quite a bit because Maddie grew up and lives in a town in Western North Carolina, in a mill town, and she really isn't exposed to many different types of people. And that's part of why I wanted to have a young protagonist who I kind of dropped into the fictional town of Brightleaf, North Carolina. And I wanted her to be an observer of two sides of life in Brightleaf. The side of the wealthy tobacco wives and the executives and what looked to be a very glamorous, privileged lives. And then on the other end, the lives of the factory workers and the dirty kind of underbelly of the tobacco industry itself. And she learned really by observing, by being in the presence of these wealthy women through a group of wives, 5 of them, who all have, I mean, are individuals in their own right, but have differing views about women's role in society. I would say she was most influenced by Cornelia, who is a character, she's one of my favorite characters. She's the matriarch of the group of tobacco wives, a very wealthy woman who is older and never really got credit for her ideas, her contributions to the town. She gave a lot of good advice to her husband, who has since passed away, but is really recognized as a leader in the community. And so I think Cornelia sees something in Maddie that she nurtures. And for those of you who've read the book, and even if you haven't, she passes along a couple of books to Maddie, and she encourages her to really find her voice, to stand up for herself, to be kind of this self-possessed young woman. And Maddie really takes that to heart over the course of that summer.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll give the same question to Beth. How do you think Maddie's opinion about women and their roles in society changed after she spent the summer living and working in Brightleaf, and who might have had, the deepest impact on her?
Yeah, I love that the book included so many different kinds of women from so many different backgrounds, and working in different types of jobs. So like her Aunt Etta obviously inspired her desire to work as a seamstress and a dressmaker. And she was a very independent woman. She sort of broke the mold in terms of she wasn't married to a man, and she worked for herself. She had her own business, and that was somewhat unusual. It wasn't necessarily what Maddie had seen before at home, because her mother was very much more of the stereotypical, you need a husband to be economically, self-sufficient. And so she has her Aunt Etta as an example, and I think that was obviously really impactful on her career choices. But also, I think she was influenced a lot by Mitzi, actually, but sort of in a what she didn't want to become. She saw Mitzi, who had all this wealth and privilege, but wasn't using it in the way that Maddie felt like she should have. And so she wanted to speak her mind where Mitzi didn't. And so I think that was very influential on her as well.
Yeah, you definitely sense the tension there between, I think, Mitzi sort of feeling like she wants to, but not ever quite able to kind of fully, do the things that she wants, I think, because of the expectations around her at that time.
Right. I think that's interesting, but it's always interesting to hear readers, and you being a historian, to hear what you kind of took away from it. And yes, I think Maddie kind of goes into things thinking, like, looking up to Mitzi and thinking, oh, she must have it all. And then as she gets more drawn into her world, she realizes, wow, things are not as perfect as they seem. And also Mitzi's motivations are in many ways about preserving her own position in the community and her status as a tobacco wife versus, someone who will do the right thing at any cost.
Yeah.
All right. Let's delve into kind of the part of the story where the executives have launched a new tobacco product. It's called Moments, with an emphasis on the mom part of it. And the subsequent advertising campaign featuring those tobacco wives was very central to the story. So Adele, what were the implications of this campaign on the characters, and talk a little bit about how you crafted the the way that the advertising is presented in the novel.
Okay, sure. So I've actually worked in advertising I've worked in public relations and advertising for over 20 years. So I joke that with my family that I managed to like vilify my home state and my chosen profession in one book. I'm kidding. I hope I don't vilify. I wanted to kind of capture this moment in history before they really knew how dangerous smoking was. And advertising at that time played a big role. The tobacco companies were among the first to use advertising and use communications to persuade audiences and to target them very specifically. And it's actually a really interesting exercise. If readers are interested in this, you can easily find old ads online. And I have some on my website. And to look back at some of these ads, it's hard to believe that they are real. They tout the health benefits of cigarettes. They feature doctors recommending cigarettes. And there's this whole element of glamour around smoking. And at the time, everyone did it. The movies, the glamour of old Hollywood at that time, stars were smoking. And so for the tobacco wives in the book, I thought it was important to feature them in the ads because they were really like the celebrities of the town. And I also wanted to link their image with the cigarettes, and it gives them a little more skin in the game, so to speak. So when Mitzi is faced with a difficult decision about what to do with the information that Maddie runs across, she has to give up that fame too, and the fact that she is so linked to the campaign itself.
Yeah. And then same question to you, Beth, about the tobacco advertising campaign. What do you think the implications of the campaign were on the various characters? And tell us a little bit about maybe tobacco advertising. I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but expand if you can on the advertising change, especially, or the advertising around tobacco, especially in the post-war period.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the advertising campaign and the story was, the central issue. It really put Maddie in this difficult position, having discovered it while, staying with these people who are, being really kind to her and giving her things and supporting her business efforts. So having to weigh, good versus bad and what she should do and what she can do and all the different implications of that. And then, of course, the way it would impact Mitzi and her decisions later on. And I love the way the advertising was represented in the book because it is pretty historically accurate with the doctor's claims. And I mean, like Adele said, you look back at these ads and it's so weird to see it now, doctors claiming that they're good for you. Or, I mean, they really were used as a treatment for asthma. And that just seems so counterintuitive to us now. That it's just mind-boggling. But in the 1940s, during World War II, cigarettes were included in rations for soldiers. And so it was considered an essential wartime industry. And so right after the war, there's, tobacco companies are still sort of riding that advertising pony, if you will. And they were able to use that in their ads during World War II, that they were, very patriotic and supporting the war effort. And then in post-World War II, they really did turn to an emphasis on health. Some questions were starting to arise. I mean, really in the entire course of the history of smoking, there's always been someone who said this isn't healthy. But those claims were starting to have a little bit more science behind them in the 1940s and 50s. And so the ads really were turning to that. And filtered cigarettes were becoming more and more key to advertising so they could make claims about, the cleanliness and the healthiness So that really was rising at the same time that the book is set.
Thank you for sharing all of the perspective, and we've got some great comments in chat about tobacco ads, and we even had someone note that their grandparents gave up teaching to become tobacco farmers because it was very profitable. So definitely seeing the impact here, just even in our chat. All right, we'll kind of move to our next question. And Adele, I'll start with you. What does the book illustrate about opportunities available to women in the post-World War II era, as well as some of the challenges that they faced?
So it was interesting. As I was writing the book, I was researching obviously that time in history and what life was like for women during the 1940s. And what I discovered is that at the end of World War II, there was a big shift that was brought about by the fact that women had taken over jobs while the men were at war. And so I decided to set the book just as the men were beginning to return. And expecting to take their jobs back. And so there was a lot of tension at that time because for many women, these were the first opportunities that they had to work outside the home, to earn their own money, to get that sense of satisfaction and independence that comes with being able to work. And for many of them, they did not want to go back to the status quo. They didn't want to have to give up their jobs. And so there were a number of strikes that took place that I read about and researched, and that inspired a scene in the book, a strike meeting among women there. And so I thought it was just a really interesting time in history. And many historians say it was really the beginning of the modern women's rights movement, this disruption that occurred during the war, and the autonomy that women got a taste of, but that they wanted, to then take away from them when the war ended.
And Beth, I'll send the same question to you. What does the book illustrate about opportunities available to women in the post-World War II era and some of the challenges that they face?
Yeah, like Adele said, World War II presented a lot of women with the opportunity to join the workforce. Women who were already working had the opportunity to take on better paying jobs. A lot of women who worked before World War II worked in sort of domestic parallel jobs in laundries or as waitresses and things like that. And when they were able to move into factory jobs, those were much better paying jobs. And so a lot of women after the war really wanted to hold on to that, like Adele said. And unfortunately, all throughout the war and afterwards, the messaging to women, though, was that this is temporary, this is temporary, this is temporary. And so they were laid off in much greater numbers than men, because after the war, certain industries needed to pare back because they had mobilized for the war effort. And so they needed to lay off people regardless, but women were definitely laid off in greater numbers than men. And it was really difficult for them to hang on to the progress made. And so it did contribute to sort of the beginnings of things like fair pay and, equal opportunities at work and things like that. But it maybe didn't contribute quite as much as it's sometimes stated, because so many women did return to the home afterwards or return to, those lesser paying jobs that they had beforehand.
I just wanted to add one thing that I thought was interesting that I ran across is, and that I thought about quite a bit since I was showing these two sides of the industry and these two groups of women, that for wealthy women, it was really frowned upon to work at all, because it suggested that your husband couldn't provide. And so I thought it was interesting as I looked at what women who took over those jobs gained as far as self-esteem. you know, you would look at the wealthy women and think, oh, well, they had it all. But in some ways, these women who were able to work and to see that they could take care of themselves, I think gained something that the wealthy women weren't able to gain. And so that played also into the decisions, for instance, that Mitzi made. I mean, Mitzi was although she was wealthy, she was completely reliant upon her husband and upon the tobacco business for their livelihood.
I loved what you did with Ashley's character. She was also well off, but she talked about the fulfillment she got from her work. And I think that was, I think that impacted Maddie a lot as well. And I thought that was really interesting to include, because historians have looked at, you know, two different reasons why women worked. And one obviously was economic need. A lot of poorer women had to work. But also it was looking for some sort of self-fulfillment and, you know, some sort of, you know, something to do, mental stimulation, that kind of thing.
So I think we'll kind of shift to Maddie's work, because as we know, Maddie is a seamstress, and she's taking it very seriously. She was practicing at home in Asheville, because occasionally she'd go out, you know, for the summer, and this trip was not really planned without giving too much away about what happens there. But she takes this craft very seriously, and it really kind of becomes her work, and she becomes very central to making these gala gowns for the tobacco wives. So what do you think Maddie's work illustrates about the social and economic impact of tobacco in North Carolina? Or specifically, what does it show about culture and fashion, but also in relation to society and economics? Because there's some important issues there at play that Maddie takes note of almost immediately, about who has access to what. So Adele, I'll let you.
Right. Well, you know, certainly during the war, there were shortages and there was rationing. And I think that's something that Maddie was very aware of, and that her family, even though they weren't wealthy, that, for instance, there were drives where people would bring in metal to be melted down and used. So she and her family were very much aware of those. And as she got drawn into the world of the Winstons, of Mitzi Winston and her husband, she realized, okay, these rules don't seem to apply here. They seem to have sugar and eggs and butter and meat and things that other folks just didn't have or had to ration and do without. And that also applied to fabrics and to sewing. And it's, as an author of historical fiction, I find it really fascinating that through the research, sometimes I will run across a fact that then inspires a whole scene. And that happened with the book as I was looking into all of the sewing. And so one example of that is I was able to find actual vintage patterns, and I ordered some of those. I like, you know, you can do so much great research online, but I also like just the tactile feel of holding something. I found vintage makeup also, like replica makeup, and used that to see what that was like. And so I ordered some of these patterns. And one of the things that people did at the time is, because there was a shortage on fabric, they would use grain bags for a substitute for simple dresses. And the grain bag manufacturers actually started to create these pretty patterns on their bags because they knew this was happening. And so there was a pattern that I got that was for a feed bag dress and oven mitts. And I ended up using that in a scene. Maddie accidentally brings that to a meeting of the tobacco wives. And that became a way for me to demonstrate the tension between two of the wives. So Cornelia, who I talked about earlier, is the matriarch. Her son marries a girl who doesn't come from the same social class. Cornelia thinks that she's really beneath her. And so Maddie inadvertently puts this feed bag dress pattern in front of her daughter-in-law, Rose, and Rose is all aghast. So that became a way for me to show the social hierarchy and the conflict that occurred there. So, and of course, Maddie is enamored with the access to all the fabrics and the notions and everything that the wealthy wives have access to. So the haves and the have-nots, the rules were very different.
Absolutely. Beth, the same question to you. What do you think Maddie's work on those gala gowns and just working for the tobacco wives, what does that show about, the intersections between culture and fashion and society and economics?
Real quick, I have a little extreme example of what Adele was talking about from the Ava Gardner Museum. During World War II, Ava was friends with Howard Hughes, who was this huge billionaire tycoon kind of guy. And he was able to get her silk to make a dress, a sort of parachute silk that was supposed to be used for the war effort, but he had a dress made out of it. So you just made me think of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't hear that story. That's great.
Yeah, it's a beautiful dress, but it's like, oh, the rules to make that dress for her.
Yeah.
I feel like Maddie's work on the gala gowns, in addition to what Adele was saying, it also demonstrates just how I feel like pervasive the tobacco industry was and how most jobs were related to it in some form or fashion. So even Maddie's work as a seamstress is heavily related to the tobacco industry and its impact on the community, and all the wealth that the tobacco industry accrues. Most of it goes to a small set of people at the top of that industry. And I think you can sort of see that through her work with the different wives. And they're obviously the fewer and the wealthiest are the ones who are at the top of that industry. But so many other people are involved in the work that goes into the tobacco industry. And even in the sort of jobs that aren't directly related, you can see the impact as the wealthy families give money to the institutions and build the town. So even the jobs that aren't directly related, in some way they are. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention, as I researched the book, I mentioned how it was inspired by my grandmother's, but I went back to my family history and kind of dug deeper. And really, when I looked at my family, I realized almost everyone in some way or another was tied to tobacco. One of my grandfathers was a home builder in Winston-Salem. My other grandfather was a banker with Wachovia Bank, which was inextricably linked with tobacco. The home builder grandfather also worked in the factories. And my father, as a teenager, worked in the cigarette factories. And he told me some stories that came from his own experience, but also from my grandfather, that were really eye-opening about the conditions there and how difficult it was. But then almost in the same breath, he said to me that everyone was so incredibly proud of helping to build the tobacco capital of the South. And there was so much good that came from tobacco money. And before they knew, it really was the pride and joy of the state. And Beth, I think you mentioned earlier, even industries that don't seem directly related, for instance, the paper industry. Paper mills were creating the paper for the cigarettes. If there were no tobacco, their sales and the demand would have been much less. So it really kind of struck me as I talked to him about that. And that is what I hope I was able to capture in this book, is that moment in time before it all began to unravel. and what that must have been like for people who were proud and hardworking and really didn't know that their livelihood was contributing to disease, even death. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think. And I mean, from the farmer's perspective, you're talking about family farms that have been in a family for generations. And I mean, they didn't realize, like you said, for a long time, it was just the accepted thing, and how difficult it was for farmers to pivot to other things because of how much goes into growing tobacco. And the pride as well in a family farm that's been doing it for generations.
Yeah, I think there's something very sad about it, very tragic. And of course, once the executives were aware and they began to cover it up, I think that's where it took, a sinister turn. But for a time, people really didn't know. And it's interesting to also think about parallels to today. And I think we still see situations, towns, whether it was a steel town or coal or, even industries that are impacted by what we're learning about the environment. You still see these towns and these industries that were so established that now have to find a new way to make a living and to adapt. And that's such a difficult challenge.
Absolutely. So before we get to our audience Q&A, which we do have quite a few, so thanks everyone for submitting all those great questions. I do want to give both Beth and Adele the opportunity to tell us if there's anything that you are working on currently that you want to share with the audience, or something kind of unique from North Carolina that you want to highlight that you're involved in. So Adele, are we going to get a sequel to the Tobacco Wives?
Not right away. I'll never say never, but I am working on a concept for my next novel, which will also be set in the South and which will also involve a cover-up situation. But this time it'll be one that is not well known at all, which I think is going to be interesting for me to write, and I hope interesting for you all to read. The one thing about the Tobacco Wives and smoking is there wasn't a big spoiler at the end. We all know how dangerous smoking is. So my editor actually said it's kind of like writing about the Titanic. Like everyone knows the ending. It's going to sink. But I think this next book will be interesting in that it's something that's not well known, but a similar theme of a Southern story that has to do with a cover up, and that cover up coming to light, those secrets coming to light.
Well, I'm intrigued.
Good. I have one reader. Oh, I see Judy said thank you.
I think there's probably more than one reader.
I hope so.
And Beth, what are you working on, or some unique projects you'd like to highlight?
There's a couple things that I think people who are interested in this book might be interested in. So one of my clients is the Tobacco Farm Life Museum, which is in Kinley, North Carolina. And I help them develop a living history program that runs every Saturday from 10 to 2, featuring costumed demonstrators doing things like butter churning, blacksmithing, talking about one-room schoolhouses, plowing, all sorts of things. And it wraps up its first year at the end of October. So there's just a few more Saturdays left for that. And then one of my other clients is the Ava Gardner Museum. I loved the Ava Gardner mention in the book, by the way. Great mention. She was a really famous movie star in 1940s, 50s, 60s. And she's from North Carolina, from the Smithfield area. So the museum is located in Smithfield, and they do an annual festival that's coming up the first weekend in October. So I've been helping them with some new exhibits and things like that. So the festival should be pretty cool. I'm going to check that out.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing those unique North Carolina experiences. So if you're in and around those towns or not, and just want to take a trip out, it might tie in if you enjoyed reading this book. So I'm going to ask my fellow staff member Megan, who is here assisting me. Megan, do we have? I believe we do have audience questions. So if you'd like to maybe start to read those off, that would be great.
We got a lot of great questions. Thank you, everyone. First one is Anissa asks Adele, what was your biggest challenge in writing your debut novel?
Hi, Anissa. I know Anissa. She's been to a couple of events. Thanks for joining. The biggest challenge was, I worked on it for many, many years while I was working full time and raising a family. And so it was a very long process. And when you're working on a debut novel, it's not like someone is sitting around waiting on this. You don't know the whole time whether you're going to even be able to get an agent interested, a publisher interested, whether anyone's going to buy it. So I think it takes a tremendous amount of faith and also just drive to do this. I think you have to be just motivated. Something in you has to be hungry to write a novel, to stick with it, because you just don't know. You don't know whether it's going to get published.
Okay. Thanks. Go ahead, Megan. You can continue to keep giving questions to Beth and Adele.
Sure. Beth Ann asks, were there a sizable number of women who were actually able to keep their factory jobs after the war? If so, did they have the same salaries as men?
Beth, I think you might be better equipped to answer that, I'm hoping.
I don't know the numbers. There certainly were women who were able to keep their jobs. Like Adele mentioned, there were protests and strikes and things. So some companies would have caved to that pressure. There's also a lot of patriotism still at the end of the war, and a lot of gratefulness for women for having stepped up to those jobs. But they certainly were laid off in really large numbers. And men did need, jobs when they returned from the war. And so that's why some historians say it wasn't quite as impactful as you sometimes hear that it was, because so many of them did lose those jobs after the war.
Adele, can you maybe share with us what your grandmothers did? Was there a point in time at which they stopped working for the tobacco families, or were they ever affected in any way, or were their jobs, I would say not in demand, but it seems like you would need hairdressers and seamstresses, but do you want to share anything about that?
Well, I think my grandmother, the hairdresser, worked for them primarily in the 40s and 50s. And then I think as she got older, and when I was growing up in the 70s, she wasn't actively working for them. She was doing volunteer work. She was very involved in her church. My other grandmother, the seamstress, did continue to work. And I guess those jobs, because they were peripheral and serving the families, she continued to do that. So I would assume it's different for women who worked in the factory or who took on jobs that were normally taken by men.
I will add, I think there was a part too about how much they were paid. I will add that there were always some women working in sort of factory type jobs. A lot of African-American women worked in factories and things like that. And they were paid less than men, and also paid less by race as well.
I also read that they were given the worst jobs.
Yes.
Because there were so many different stages in tobacco farming, but also in the handling of the tobacco. And so stripping it was a process that would really tear up your hands, and that a lot of African American women would get those less desirable jobs.
Yes, they tended to work more in like stimmeries and the redrying plants and things like that, versus the actual, rolling of the cigarettes and that kind of thing. And Black men as well worked in more of the hard labor kinds of jobs in a factory, like moving the hogsheads around and things like that.
That's a good important distinction and clarification to make. Thank you for adding that in. Megan, do we have some more questions?
We do. Beth Ann has another great question for Adele. Why did you decide to write the epilogue?
Endings are so difficult, and to create a sense of closure for the reader, but not to tie up everything too neatly in a bow. And I didn't want to leave the reader without a sense of what happened to these characters. The whole book takes place over the course of one summer, and a lot happens during that summer, but I wanted the reader to find out what happened, and where did Maddie end up, and what did Maddie end up doing? And most importantly, I wanted to end on Maddie having an opportunity to finally make an impact on this issue that she fought so hard for as a girl, but was not able at that time to make a difference. So the easiest way for me to do that was to include the epilogue.
Okay. Beth, do you have any thoughts on the epilogue, or kind of the conclusion of that, as it's set more in the future? It would be the past for us now, but it's future in the book.
Right. As a reader, I welcomed that. That's not always nice to kind of see what happens to a character that you're invested in. And as a historian, it's history, but the 90s, the epilogue is set. It's really interesting to hear things like the Truth in Advertising campaign mentioned. I remember seeing like those ads and things when I was growing up. That was really interesting to see, kind of bring us up to the present, more or less, and what happened with the tobacco industry.
Thank you. All right, Megan, I think we've got time for a few more questions. I see everyone's still populating some of those in the Q&A, so that's great.
Hold on, pull it up. Teresa notes that her classmates worked in tobacco for cash that was not taxed. She wants to know if this was a common practice in the industry and if the government ever tried to track these missing taxes.
Interesting.
I think that was fairly common for younger people to sort of work under the table. And as a lot of farms were family farms, it'd be probably fairly easy to get away with working for a summer for like your aunt or your uncle or something like that. I don't know what the government's reaction was to it, to be honest, but I do think it was fairly common.
Okay. And yeah, we see that with Maddie. Alone there, she's working with her aunt, and it can be, fairly common. Okay. Megan, we have some additional questions.
Sure. As one of our participants would like to know, Adele, would you like to talk about the cover? Did you get to work with the artist any? Did you get any input on it?
Sure. And actually, for those of you who haven't seen it, here it is. Features this old Zippo lighter, which I think has a lot of history and nostalgia. I was able to actually share my thoughts about and ideas with my editor before they started working on the cover. So she wanted to know if there was anything in particular that I really liked or did not like. I put together, because I've worked in marketing my whole career, I put together a little presentation. So she probably maybe was sorry she asked. But I I knew I wanted something that was very pretty and that incorporated tobacco leaves, but that also felt not edgy, but was not expected necessarily for historical fiction. I think a lot of historical fiction novels feature women on the cover in a setting, and I wanted it to look different, to be kind of arresting and to make the reader stop and say, well, what is this? So thankfully, my editor also had similar feelings about an arresting visual, about using leaves, about it being very pretty as a cover, and the team just did an amazing job with it. So I'm very, very happy. And I've heard from so many readers. I see Judy's comment that she loved the cover. People really, they are motivated when they see a beautiful cover to pick it up. So, it's interesting. One of the things I've realized is what a team effort it is to put out a book and for the book to do well. And yes, the author wrote it, but there are many hands in editing, in helping to shape the story, in marketing the book, in the cover, and even the internal pages. Another designer did the internal pages, which have leaves and are also just beautiful. So that's how it works with me. I think it may differ from author to author and depending on your publisher, but I was able to have a hand in that, which I really appreciated.
That's a great parallel to, I think, what goes on in the book, right? There were many hands that were required to make the cigarettes, and there were many hands that were required to make those dresses. So thank you for sharing that process with us, Adele.
Sure.
I think we've got time. We've got a couple more questions in here, so I'd like to get to both of those if we're able. And it looks like, go ahead, Megan, I'll let you read the questions out.
Sure, thanks. Ginny asks, did the workers really have access to the dust, dirt, and tobacco cigarettes?
The like reconstituted cigarettes, I assume, is what you're asking about. So yes, and that's a true story that was handed down, and that I learned about through my father. That there's a scene in the book where Maddie realizes that there are these two different factories. There's one that's more accessible to all the workers, and then there's one that's under armed guard, lock and key. Only certain folks can work there, and that is because they would sweep up the floor sweepings from the first factory and take them to the second one and cook them in this slurry and then dry them and create what was reconstituted. They called it reconstituted cigarettes. So those were the off-brand, no-name cigarettes that were cheaper, that were, and I mean, that story in itself kind of floored me. And and it's, if you look up reconstituted cigarettes online, it's easy to find that information, but I think most people don't know that. And to hear the details of it from a family member was pretty eye-opening for me.
Go ahead, Beth, you can jump in and share.
I had never heard of them actually myself until I read about it in your book, and so I looked them up as well. And it's something that R.J. Reynolds started. They were the ones who started that practice. So I thought that was interesting. A little disturbing, but interesting.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Right. And Megan, I think we've got time for one more question from Kim.
Great. I'm saving this to the end because it's a very fun question. Beth and Adele, if you were characters in the Tobacco Wives, who would you be and why?
Beth, would you like to answer first? Would you like to answer first?
It's hard. I liked several of these women. They were very likable women. I don't know. I know she was sort of a minor character, but I really enjoyed Ashley and all the scenes that had Ashley in them. She was Mitzi's sister. but a little bit less, I don't know how to describe it. She worked for herself, even though she didn't have to. She was wealthy. And she was a mother, but she wanted to work for that fulfillment. And I don't know, just I guess I related to that. I liked her.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say Maddie, just because she's my protagonist. She's the character I most deeply had to understand and live, within her in order to tell the story from her perspective. But if I got a second vote, it would definitely be Cornelia, because I love the fact that she's this feisty, very intelligent woman who comes across very tough, but has this soft spot for Maddie.
Yeah, I would agree. Cornelia does rock. I really loved her episode of I'm just wearing this exclusive mauve color from France.
Yes.
I can and I will wear it head to toe.
That was another example of something that I found as I was researching, that was a real phenomenon, that color was very popular in Europe. They couldn't get it in the US. And so again, like that little tidbit of history that became a way for me to reveal character, to reveal that Cornelia was ambitious and thinking and a smart businesswoman. And also to give the reader that image of her wearing her mauve.
Yes, it was very business savvy. She was, I think, ahead of the curve or trying to be there, and you get those hints and glimmers of the whole time that there's a lot going on around in the background with these, women characters, that they're contributing a lot that
right
goes unnoticed otherwise.
Right. Yeah, the hidden history of women's activism, I think, is a big thing that I wanted to bring through in the book.
Well, I think that is going to wrap up our questions. So I will move through some concluding remarks. I want to thank both Adele and Beth for their conversation and their perspective today. So interesting to hear that blending of history and, the real life inspiration from Adele's family to make this book.